Hi everyone, I am back with chapter 6 of Little Faith by Nickolas Butler. But I figured that I would just give a brief summary of what has happened over the past 5 chapters. So we have been introduced to Lyle, Isaac, Shiloh, Pastor Charlie, and Peg. And we have found out that Peg and Lyle have lost their son when he was about 9 months old. And that has caused Lyle to question his faith and not really believe in God anymore. But Shiloh comes back into their life after being gone with her son Isaac, and he's finding purpose in caring for Isaac, and he loves being around him. And Shiloh is very religious. So it seems that she might be able to spark a new faith in God again for him. But we haven't really gotten very far into it. We know that Lyle is struggling with his faith and really loves his grandson Isaac, but Isaac also reminds him of the son that he lost. So he's kind of grappling with that balance. So I think that this is a good time to start chapter 6. And chapter 6 starts on page 49. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to turn to that page. The sourdough orchard rode a saddle of land stretching nearly all the way from the Mississippi River slows east up the towering sandstone bluffs where eagles, hawks, and vultures wheeled endlessly, with a county highway to the north of the orchard, a deep coulee to the south, and to the west, of course, the river and its namesake road. The morning shadows across this land were extravagantly dark and blue, while the afternoons were drawn in infinite shades of gold and brass as the sun set across the river over Minnesota. It was an ideal place to be an apple tree. Lyle rose early most mornings, though not before Peg, who moved about the house in her warm flannel nightgown, now and then checking her cherished laptop and the family's pictures and dispatches she was kept constantly apprised of on Facebook. Not so much sharing with Lyle the social media news as talking to herself out loud, saying, "Well, now, looks like Maya is pregnant again." Or, "What a shame, Elsa's boy Zachary is getting another divorce." And Lyle, puttering around their kitchen, grinding coffee, washing dishes, wiping down the counters, or spreading butter and marmalade across his toast, murmuring, "You don't say," or something equally banal, for he had in the past, when not exactly listening, offered the wrong "that's too bad" at an inopportune time, such as when Peg announced that her cousin Nancy had posted an entire album's worth of photos documenting her travels to Norway, fjords, waterfalls, idyllic harbors, etc. He had learned over decades of marriage that when he was not actively listening to Peg, it was in fact more dangerous to pretend that he was. Oftentimes, a well-placed humming noise, grunt, or uh-huh was the best. His thermos filled, Lyle would say goodbye to Peg, for Shiloh and Isaac would not yet have roused from the two downstairs bedrooms, and drive the old Ford just south of town before angling east toward the small orchard, where he was the sole employee, paid cash under the table every Friday, once the owners, Otis and Mabel Haskell, had tabulated his hours from an 89-cent spiral notebook, where such pertinent information was kept stored and safeguarded. Lyle had spent almost 30 years of his life working at Redford Appliance and Repair, a small family-owned appliance store on the edge of town that sold everything from toasters and microwaves to snowblowers and lawnmowers, and almost anything in between: stoves, washers and dryers, garbage disposals, refrigerators, freezers, dishwashers, vacuums, even furnaces and air conditioners. And what they sold, they also fixed and repaired. In this way, even though their market was small, they managed to stay in business, if not exactly thrive year to year, with a ferociously loyal clientele. Hoot, too, had worked at Redford Appliance, sometimes on the floor as a salesman and during the slower winter months in the back room, performing surgery on busted Hoover vacuum cleaners or old Amana ranges. Lyle had loved his work and his customers, for they were his neighbors, his relatives, his in laws. When a customer complained about their dishwasher not working properly, he'd known precisely which machine they were referring to and in which room it had been installed. He could imagine that house's circulatory systems of plumbing and electricity, how that house smelled or how it sighed in a strong wind. How old's your dish soap? Lyle might ask. Excuse me, they'd say. Your dish soap. Are you using those little crystals? Yeah, the little crystals come out of the green box, Cascade. Right, Lyle would say. Do me a favor. When you get home, pour about a teaspoon of those soap crystals into your palm and then rub your hands together. Afterward, call me. And later that afternoon, they would call Redford A&R. Hey, Lyle, I did what you said and rubbed them soap crystals between my hands. What gives? Did the soap feel hot against your skin? Gee, they'd pause. I'd have to think about that. A pause would settle over the telephone line. No, I never felt anything. No heat, anyways. You mean like a burn or something? I don't understand, Lyle. Your soap is too old, Lyle would say. Buy yourself a new box of soap, and I bet that dishwasher will work perfectly. Over 30 years, Lyle worked at Redford A&R, helping his community in the most basic and measurable ways possible. But by his late 50s and early 60s, as Redford began to slowly depopulate, business trailed off. The day Redford A&R closed was the day Lyle more or less retired and began accepting Social Security. He was at peace with this, even as he wasn't sure what exactly he'd do in retirement to occupy his days, short of becoming jack of all trades, repairing appliances around Redford until those aging Whirlpools, Frigidaires, KitchenAids, GEs, and the rarefied Viking or Wolf gave up the ghost. Then, about 2 years into his retirement, Otis Haskell, who had made it a point to support Redford A&R throughout his life and was considered by many to be the town's resident eccentric liberal academic, called him up and offered him a job at the sourdough orchard. And that position, such as it was, had become a godsend for Lyle, not because of the money it paid, which in truth was very little, but because the cycles of the orchard gave him something he'd been lacking without even knowing it, meaning. And two, he rediscovered the glory of working outdoors. On this spring morning, Lyle parked near the apple house, where the harvest was kept and refrigerated in wooden crates, though by now it contained nothing but the sweet, leftover fragrance of last year's crop. Then knocked on the Haskells' door before entering. They would be sitting at the kitchen table, he knew, waiting for him, reading their morning newspaper. Otis, already dressed for the day in his trademark key denim bibs, a yellow chamois cloth shirt, a sweat-stained, long-brimmed baseball cap with a neck cape, a yellow Dixon Ticonderoga #2 pencil lodged behind his ear, and an ancient pair of white Nikes, grass-stained nearly to Kelly green. Mabel, still in her nightgown and cheap pink slippers, an overly large bathrobe draped over her slender frame and cinched tightly around her narrow waist. Good morning, Lyle, Otis said. Lyle took a seat at the table. Otis was gnashing on an overripe banana, waving a persistent fruit fly away, while Mabel scratched the back of her head with a blunted pencil. How's that grandson of yours doing? You ought to start bringing him out here. We can get him all trained up. Boundless energy, Lyle replied, smiling. He keeps us busy. And how's my girl Shiloh? She found a job yet? Otis asked, glancing over the thick and profoundly scratched lenses of his glasses. Asked to select a single word to describe Otis, Lyle might have chosen frugal, or perhaps simply cheap. The man threw nothing away, bought very little, and almost everything he and Mabel owned was in some state of slow, steady disrepair. Their pickup truck, their old four-door Volkswagen diesel, their aging house, their clothes, the fences of the orchard. Both Otis and Mabel were children of the Great Depression, and their childhoods had been Spartan, if not at times desperate. Mabel had grown up outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, and still clutched a distant memory of one of her cousins dying of just pneumonia. And even though Otis had for decades been a beloved faculty member of the University of Minnesota's Horticulture Science Department, he rarely spent a dime save on the orchard itself. He often joked that this acreage, this assemblage of old buildings, these hundreds of trees, all of it was his own private folly. I guess there's a church outside of La Crosse. They might have a secretary job for her, Lyle said. Isaac could have free daycare. In truth, though, he could not quite understand this plan of Shiloh's, ranging so far away from their home on two-lane roads for a job paying $9 an hour and without health benefits. And yet he felt such gratitude for having her and Isaac nearby. He dared not utter even the most benign criticism for fear of chasing her away. If you've lost your spot, we're at the top of page 55. Lacrosse, hey? Otis said. That's a bit of a jaunt, isn't it? Hopefully she's got four-wheel drive. Those river roads get treacherous. Lyle frowned. I suppose she could take my truck if she needed to. Mabel sighed deeply, staring at the puzzle. A four-letter word for black rock. Coal, Lyle offered. No, Mabel countered. Ends with an X of all things. Otis rammed the last of his banana into his mouth and said through the mush, Onyx. Mabel eyeballed him with equal measures of derision and appreciation. The old coot's mostly useless, but even a broken clock's right twice a day. Otis stood from the table, and Lyle followed him outside. The morning air was cool, fog collecting in the coulee, and high overhead, a bald eagle was soaring on the day's first thermals. I'd like to spray those Macintosh today, Otis said. Maybe check on the Cortlands, I suppose. We could get some mowing done, too. They piled tools into the back of Lyle's truck and drove the short distance to the fenced entrance of the orchard, where a 10-foot-high wire enclosure kept the deer from destroying the trees. Otis opened the gate, and Lyle drove right into the orchard. Soon they donned their leather gloves and began the day's work. Through spring and early summer, the orchard was a place of preparation, mowing and raking, spraying insecticides, and in places cutting out dead trees to replace them with new saplings. The fence line always needed repairing. There were piles of dead branches to burn, bandages to be removed from trunks, supports for young trees that needed restaking. More than enough labor for two old men. Lyle liked working in late spring before the season's real heat socked in, and air still cool and wet but carrying the warmer promises of summer. Migratory birds were returning up the Mississippi Flyway, and there were times he looked up from his work to see some burst of color fly through the sky, or to follow the exotic song of a bird he'd forgotten since fall. At lunchtime, they broke off work and returned to the Haskell's home, the kitchen smelling of Campbell's tomato soup left unattended in its pot and beginning to burn. A stack of grilled cheese sandwiches sat on a plate, the orange Kraft slices oozing from between slices of unevenly toasted Wonder Bread. On the counter, a mostly depleted jar of Vlasic pickles, a bowl of stale saltines, and a bag of old Hershey's Kisses, chocolate grown chalky with age. Mabel had set out plates and bowls for the men to serve themselves buffet style when she sat in the living room, still mumbling over her crossword puzzle, but mostly waiting for her stories to begin. Their soap opera was just starting. Otis installed himself in his most favored chair, set a TV tray before himself, worked his feet out of the battered Nikes, and exhaled deeply. We are now on the top of page 57. Lyle, still in the kitchen, washed his hands in the sink. The Haskells often bought their groceries at a nearby gas station, whichever store was the cheapest. This gas station was also stocked the overripe bananas Otis preferred, on sale for as little as a dime a pound. Now, is Hope back with Bo, or is she still fooling around with that other man? Otis asked as he bit into his sandwich, eyeballing Mabel. These stories are all the same. I can't keep any of it straight. I thought Hope was kidnapped down by the wharf. Lyle called in from the kitchen. He often dozed during their afternoon program. That's Merlina, Mabel clarified. Hope was in the hospital visiting Roman. Now be quiet, please. Lyle carried his plate into the living room and settled into another easy chair closer to the window where he sat heavily, looking out at the afternoon sky. He wondered what Peg had planned for Isaac, whether or not Shiloh would be working that day, if he might suggest other work for her, some job that didn't require her to drive so far from home on such narrow roads. The police chief of Salem should be ashamed, Otis said at last, crunching a pickle. So much god-awful crime. At about 5 o'clock, or something a bit before, they quit, locking up the orchard's gate behind them, and drove back to the Apple House, where they said their goodbyes. We'll see you tomorrow, Lyle called as he pulled out away. I'll be right here, replied Otis, waving a hand, unless I'm dead. Lyle shook his head. Otis was 86 years old and sharp as a thorn. There were days Lyle wondered if the older man might well outlast him. Some days Isaac came with Lyle to the orchard. The Haskells doted on the boy, serving him hot chocolate in the mornings while they all drank weak coffee and watched him in fascination. Mabel withdrew freshly baked pans of cookies and brownies from the oven, and Lyle watched as Isaac's eyes grew wide. Many summer mornings, the boys stayed with Mabel, helping her clean the dishes or sitting in her lap as they watched Sesame Street or some other PBS program. Once Lyle and Otis had come back in for lunch and found the two of them eating buttered popcorn, watching The Sound of Music on an old VHS tape. Other times, Isaac sat between Lyle and Otis on the bench seat of the truck as they rode up to the orchard. When Otis opened the truck's passenger door in order to unlock the orchard gate, the boy would follow, closing the door behind them. Cherished is a strong word, but it is true that Lyle cherished such days. The slant of late spring light, his hands in the branches, happening upon the delicate nests of unseen songbirds, the sweet smell of cut grass, the earthy rot of wet fallen leaves, the ditch flowers and lilacs, the rare, treasured morel mushrooms, the electricity of bees and their ecstatic drive for pollen, his grandson climbing into the lowered limbs of a tree to hide, or running through the orchard, a turkey feather in each outstretched hand as if he were flying. Or, there again, sitting mostly still in his little blue jacket, pulling grass from the earth. You know how to make a grass into a whistle? Otis asked once. The boy laughed. The old man looked at him with some mock seriousness. You think I'm teasing you? Isaac nodded. Otis slowly sat down by him in the grass, pulled a single long blade from the ground, and said, Now, you hold it up here between your right pointer finger and your thumb. Then you put your two hands together, kind of like you're praying, with this little window between your hands. Then you blow. And he did, and the sound was like that of a whistle. Yes, but also a bird call of sorts. Isaac smiled. Now, just look around. You've got a field of whistles. He mussed the boy's head again. That ought to keep you busy. For an afternoon, the orchard was filled with the sounds of strange whistling, the boy ranging off down the ridge, but they never worried about him, that sound carrying, eerie and playful through the rows of trees. And what better thing than to be a young child, let loose out into the wide world to explore without a hint of danger, because it was adults, of course, who introduced danger into the world, always adults. Other days, Mabel drove up to the gate in the old Volkswagen and honked the horn, and Isaac would positively race toward her, hardly big or tall enough to open the gate, but open it he would, laboriously. And Mabel carefully pulling into the orchard, and Isaac closing the gate behind her, and then racing to the side of the stout gray automobile, where she would hand him a large woven basket that the child would clumsily carry down toward the old men, in time, Mabel following behind. And then she would unfurl an old flannel blanket, moth eaten through the years, and all four of them would sit, and she would dole out salami, cheese, and mayonnaise sandwiches wrapped in paper towels, potato chips, celery sticks, carrots, and brownies, perhaps a thermos of apple cider. Once Lyle remembered, there was even a bottle of French wine, presented to the Haskells as a gift, of course, and three little mason jars, and how decidedly civilized he felt, sitting in that vernal orchard, splitting an entire bottle of Bordeaux, and then standing to feel the tilt and spin of the planet beneath him, his grandson hugging him about the leg, and then Lyle lifting him up, feeling not 65 years old, not at all, but as he'd felt when Shiloh was just a little girl, and he would pick her up and twirl her around, and then muzzle close to her neck. Oh, he loved the boy, and that was all there was to it. And that is the end of chapter 6. So I will see you back here for chapter 7.